All right, good evening. Such a loud, authoritative voice. Better stand up straight. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It's wonderful to see a lot of new faces, and I think this is a really thrilling topic for us. We're really delighted to be able to host this gorgeous exhibition, Splashes of Color, Chinese Woodblock Prints from the Youwei Dujai collection. And the Youwei Dujai collection is actually, and this is revealed only in this space, the collection of Thomas and Patricia Ebrey of Seattle. So it is no mystery then that our speaker tonight, Professor Thomas Ebrey, is the foremost authority, certainly in the West, and one of the most foremost authorities in the world on the topic of Chinese woodblock prints. And I have to indulge in a little bit of personal history. I first met Thomas and his wife Patricia in Kyoto. I was at Kyoto University doing my dissertation research, and Pat, who is a scholar of especially Song Dynasty Chinese history, was there on a postdoc, and Tom was affiliated with the sciences at the university. And I have known all along that he was involved in the sciences. And I sort of had this vague sense of what it was. And because we were always talking about Chinese paintings or prints, I never probed the topic. So today I looked him up. And he works on light energy transduction by retinal proteins. And the rest of it sounds very fascinating and very complicated, but a lot of words that I don't know. So it's always an interesting reminder that we all are ignorant about a great many things, and our areas of expertise are tiny and limited. But what is so wonderful is that a science person has become so completely enamored of this field and has assembled one of the finest collections in private hands that he lent it to us. This is only the second exhibition in North America to focus on Chinese woodblock prints. The first was a show at the Met that borrowed from the British Museum, so we're the first on an American-based collection. So it's a rare and wonderful opportunity. I ask you to join me in welcoming Thomas Ebrey to the podium. And now we do. Go ahead. And I think you just the down arrow.
Down arrow. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Mary Beth, for a very nice introduction, and especially for the incredible installation that's downstairs of the Chinese woodblock print. It's really marvelous, and I'm very thrilled to see it again when I came here. So the question, to some extent, is telling somebody how did a poor farm boy from Oklahoma get into Chinese woodblock prints, and the transition was Chinese paintings that Mary Beth talked about, that we were very interested in Chinese paintings and pursued Chinese paintings for about 30 years, and as a consequence, went to many, many exhibitions of Chinese art. But just right after we moved to Seattle in 1978, I went to a small auction house which often has some art. It's mostly household goods, things like this, estate sales, and they had some woodblock prints they said were Chinese. And in the 30 years of going to Chinese art exhibitions, I'd never seen any Chinese woodblock prints, and was quite taken by them, but didn't know anything at all about them. But since they were at a small auction house in Seattle and nobody knew anything about them, you could get them for a very modest price. And so I bought them and tried to spend the next couple of years trying to figure out what they were. And the back was written, Shujujia Shuhuapu, the 10 Bamboo Studio collection of calligraphy and painting. But I didn't know very much about that. These were the kind of prints that were in the prints we bought. They're page size, and a little bigger than 8.5 by 11, but just slightly larger than that. Folded down the middle, put together like this, so they look like a butterfly. And when they're put into a book, they're called a butterfly binding. You put the book itself has 186 pictorial pictures and 140 poems. Every picture, except for the orchid ones, comes with a poem written out by a usually well-known literati figure of the time. So each of the volumes in the book was actually bound into 16 facsiles. Each one had about 10 poems and 10 paintings, and altogether slightly more than, well, altogether 16. Some of them didn't have any poems, and some of them didn't have just a few extra pictures. And when I was trying to figure out what these were about, I was extremely lucky in that somebody had written a very good article about this in 1951, Robert Treat Paine, who was the curator of Japanese art at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And he had just gotten enamored with this and wrote a very, very good article that was based partially because he could just borrow things from anybody. In those days, you just ask a museum to send you something and they'd put it in the mail and mail it to you. And he had all these things just laid out, and he'd turn the pages and compare them. And he decided that what he had was, in fact, the true first edition that was done the late Ming Dynasty. Ming Dynasty ended in 1644. The preface for this book was done in 1633. This is what happens when something is 400 years old and you turn the pages by grabbing down here. They get a little dirty and smudgy, but they're really quite striking and beautiful. So some of the leaves actually had dates as early as 1619, so we know the project started in 1619 and took 14 years at least to come to total fruition. It was done in Nanjing, which was the secondary capital of the Ming. The Ming had two capitals, the main capital in Beijing and the secondary capital in Nanjing. It was a real headquarters of literati of all sorts and of the publishing industry that was really at its height at the end of the Ming. And this was incredibly one of the very first books published by a young publisher, Hu Zhengyang, who then went on to publish many, many other books, including some art books like this. But to pick something this incredibly difficult and hard to put together as his first effort is just, to me, unbelievable. So as I started to work on this, I had a slight advantage in that I was collaborating with somebody in Boston. And so about every 6 months, I'd have to go to Boston. The Robert Treat Paine's book was in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And one of the very nice things about this is museums are, in general, very, very nice. If you know what you want very specifically and have a specific question, and they let me look at their album, and I took a picture or two and brought it back and tried to compare it to the pictures of the leaves we had bought, and they sort of made some sense, but they didn't do others. And so 6 months later, I went back to Boston and I took some more pictures and looked at them and then came back. And then 6 months later, I'd come back to Boston and take even more pictures. Then finally, I realized I should just take pictures of everything. That I just was a slow learner. And two things happened to make this possible. This is back in the stone era of almost 20 years ago. Digital cameras were coming out. You can't use a flash in a museum. They don't want flashes on their works of art. But with a digital camera, you can take a picture without a flash. It comes out very well. They didn't have too good anti-shaking provisions at first, and so about 10% of my pictures were not very good. But the other thing is that if you want to have a color print of something, it used to cost a fortune, $40, $50. Now, all of a sudden, you had inkjet printers, paper was cheap, you could just print things out. They only cost 50 cents or $1 to print out something. So two major technical innovations made what happens next possible. Let me first talk about a couple of problems with the 10 Bamboo Studio. Because of the butterfly binding, the pages folded together and stuck together and then glue put on the edges to hold the thing together in a facile, the pages can fall out very easily. And I've picked up many facials of this where every page has come out, just sort of stuck inside the folder. As a consequence of that, always there are lots of pages missing from the complete book. The Boston only had about 2/3 of the total number of pages. I started to notice some differences between the Boston leaves and my leaves when they had the same image, and I was trying to figure out what the differences were. Sometimes the seals were different, always the seals were different. And were the differences random or systematic? What was going on? And I realized that if I took enough pictures, I could answer a question that people have posed for a long time, which is how many editions of this book were made? The default thing is to say dozens of editions were made, and that's been said many times, but I'll show it's not true. And then what were the distinguishing features of the true first impressions of the print? And then something else, which I won't talk about at all today, is who were the artists and the poets who contributed to put the book together. There were about 30 artists and 120 poets and calligraphers that contributed to the book. So the way to do this was to see every copy that exists of the 10 Bamboo Studio any place in the world, which is a nice thing to do. And I did it sort of as a side project for a number of years, and then towards the end got a little fanatic. And just went everywhere. And again, the amazing thing is that 99% of the museums and libraries that held these things were extremely nice and welcoming. They wanted to find out what they had and allowed me to take these pictures, which I then went back and spent lots of time doing. This is the kind of project that a been retired for 10 years, professor could do because the payoff is extremely long in coming and very slow. It took, nobody whose career was involved could possibly do this, but I could. And so I saw about 250 copies of the book and sorted them out and found out that there are not dozens of the editions made, but there was only the original edition that went through a number of changes and then 6 total recut editions. Of the recut editions, 4 of them are Japanese, but one of them I would have to take half an hour to prove to you is Japanese. It's not at all obvious. And then the Chinese recut editions totally in 1817 and 1879. The blocks themselves went through a number of changes. The first edition, I think, lasted about 70 years, and then they changed all the seals, but they kept the pictorial blocks the same and the poem blocks the same. They recut the text, and then after about another 100 years, they just threw away those seals, whether they're broken or worn out, don't know, and sort of just made up seals that had nothing to do with each other. The first time they copied the seals, the second time they didn't, and then by the time they did this, what I call superstate, they put a new group of seals on that had nothing to do with any of the older seals, and they started recutting some of the blocks because they're getting so worn. So this is 250 years later. These blocks were used from 1633 to at least 1879. Now, I'm sure after 1879. They were incredibly worn in 1879. There was no way this was a quality product. It was really awful looking, and nobody would believe you if you told them that they were the original blocks because they looked so badly, but they were if you look long enough. So what I found out in going around and tracking these guys down is that there were no complete copies anyplace in the world. All copies were missing at least a couple of leaves, but most of them were missing 10, 20, 30% of the leaves. In fact, is if I made a criterion of having at least 100 of the 186 pictorial leaves, there were only 16 of these sets in the world. A lot of them in the West, a few in China, a couple in Japan. Many had not been recognized as being original printings. I found one in Moscow that had actually been in Manchuria, and the Russians had liberated it in 1945, that they had no idea that it was actually anything. It's really a lovely copy, very nice. Seals of the National Manchurian Railroad on the cover field. Since I published this article in 2010, I've found a new copy about every 2 or 3 years, but I haven't found any for the last 2 or 3 years, so it's been a bad thing. But they're out there, I guess that's the thing. I saw one in a private collection in Taiwan when I was there a few months ago, but I'd known about that for a long time. Now, there's a couple of things which are really remarkable about this, and though I say there's only 16 or now 20 copies of this in the world, that's an incredibly large number of copies for a Chinese color woodblock printed book of the 17th century. All the other books that are known are present in just 1 or 2 or 2.5 copies. So possibly the earliest books are some erotic books that were done around 1600. They belonged to a Japanese collector. They disappeared around 1960, and then they reappeared about 7, 8 years ago. His family had just been holding them and didn't tell anybody about this. So they're the only copy. Unfortunately, none of them are dated. They're just by style. They're very early. There's a book of ink cake designs called the Chengsha Maoyuan. It's done in 1606. The early copies of this book had some very simple Chinese color woodblock prints in them, but there's only 2.5 copies of this book around, 2 fairly complete copies and a half a copy in London. Then the Laoshuan Bingju Jianpu, sorry for my Chinese, is a book of letter paper. I'll discuss letter paper in just a few minutes. But this was done in the late Ming. There was a half of a copy of this book that was known to exist in Japan, but it didn't have a date, so people didn't know what it was. And then around 1960, a complete copy was found in China. It's now in the Shanghai Museum. So there's 1.5 copies of this book in all the world. There's an incredibly beautiful book in the Cologne Museum of East Asian Art, the illustrations of a famous Chinese drama and novel, the Shishangji, the Dream of the West Chamber. West Chamber. This book was first published and announced in the 1970s, printed, and now there's been a reproduction of it made. There's a book in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, 10 Views of Mount Wu, which is really a travelogue of Hangzhou. It's the only copy in the world of that book. There's a book of letter paper done by the same publisher that did the Shujujia Shuhuapu, the Ten Bamboo Studio collection of painting and calligraphy. This is a collection of letter paper. At first, there was just a partial copy of this known in China. And in the 1930s, it became publicized, and one of the woodblock print studios in China started making letter paper based on this old Ming Dynasty letter paper book. And some of that letter paper is down in the exhibition that was done in the 1930s by Rongbao Jai. And then in the mid to late 1940s, a complete copy of the book was found. And there are now maybe 3.5 copies. Unfortunately, there's always parts of the book. Only, I think, one totally complete altogether, but you can piece it together from the other ones. Almost all of these are in China. There's one part in the West. This was recut as woodblock prints in 1952 and has become a very rare book from the 1952 edition. Another well-known, famous to people interested in Chinese painting is the Jiezhiyuan Huachuan, the Mustard Seed Garden painting manual, which is a manual that tells you how to paint. There had been painting manuals before in China, but they were not directed towards landscape painting. And this was the first painting manual for landscape painting. I'll talk about this somewhat more. So in the Ten Bamboo Studio, what were the innovations? Well, color is the big thing. Was it the first Chinese color woodblock printed book? Probably not. You sort of don't know how the book came out. The first dated, for sure, earlier printed book is 1626. The general introduction of this is 1633, but parts of it could have been published as early as 1619. So around then, it came out. But the big thing is, instead of using lines of color, like this 1626 book did, use large splotches of color, broad strokes, without outlines. Up until then, Chinese book illustrations were just in ink, all in outlines. So here we have the broad, boneless kind of brushwork like you see in Chinese painting. The other thing that is, in a sense, more innovative about this book than even being printed in color is the graded brushwork. So that this was the first book printed in China in which you had a leaf or a flower blossom where the intensity of the ink varied as you went from one side of the block to the other. This has to be done by the printer, so on every thing which is graded, every block which is graded, and so no two prints will ever be the same because the printer had to do handwork on each and every one. Hu Zhengyang was so taken with this that of the 186 leaves in the book, I think I counted 179 of them use this technique. So not used just for the first time, but just used for the first time completely. And I'll show you some examples of this here. This is one of the very simplest leaves of the orchid volumes, but you can see that the flowers, there's a graded brushwork. In Japanese, it's called bokashi, and I think people who know about Japanese prints are familiar with this. There is a technical term in Chinese too, but it's not nearly so common. Here is another print in which you can see the gradedness on the bamboo leaves, but there is something else here, which is, to me, even more incredible. If you look at the yellow flower blossoms, at the tip of them, there's red. So somebody has taken the yellow and made it graded down to a slightly lesser value at one end, and then put red on there and had that slide away. So there's what I call double bokashi. That is two graded events happening on the same block at the same time. So this is a real tour de force of the printer. There's about 25 leaves in the whole 186 that do this. And in later printings, that's one of the things that is given up on because it's difficult and time-consuming to do. Besides these 20 sets of large numbers of prints, there are 3 sets of prints that I found that are very early. There's one set in the British Museum, one in the Mubon Foundation, which is in London, of about 20 plates, and then 20 leaves that we have, a lot of which are on the gallery downstairs. These are what I call very early impressions that have all sorts of differences. Some of them are not so interesting, like they have signatures on some of the leaves in the very early impressions that they never put on later on, but some of them are very technical. One of them is this idea of blown ink. So if you go back to the exhibition later on and look at this, at the bottom, there are round splotches of ink. Can't be made by a woodblock. It's done in Chinese painting since the 10th century. What has happened is that the printer has not printed. He's taken a bamboo tube filled with ink and blown that ink onto the ground here to make these perfectly round splotches. But he did something else too. He had to mask this off, so there's no blown ink on the other thing. So this is, again, a very technically difficult thing to do, and it's only been done on 4 exemplars I've ever seen. this one downstairs, and then 3 very early, but not as early as this, printings in the National Library of China. Another thing which is a little hard to see in this slide, but you can see it downstairs if you move your head around, is that there's embossing on this leaf here. The veins of these broad leaves have been blind stamped with embossing. Again, it's something that Ming printers, the early 17th century printers, started to do and then lost this technique for a couple hundred years and then have started doing it again in the 1950s. So far I've only found 3 very small sets of these, and I believe that someplace out there there's more. But you just have to keep looking, and I think, yeah, just keep looking, and if anybody sees any Ten Bamboo prints, just send me a photo and I'll try to place it in context. The other book that I have worked on for the last few years is the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual. This has got to be the most popular painting manual ever in the history of the world, because in the late 19th century you could make lithographic editions of it. And they did hundreds of thousands of these in Shanghai. Every printing press in Shanghai had its own edition of it. But the original book was first done in 1879, so it's another 17th century book. 1679, what did I say? Oh, sorry, yeah. Check me. Yeah, 1679. And then in 1701, 22 years later, 2 other parts were done. The 2 other parts were how to paint bamboo, orchids, chrysanthemums, and plums. That's part 2. And then part 3 was how to paint birds, insects, and plants. But the landscape one was actually the most influential. And almost every single painter in China and in Japan, after this came out, wanted to have an edition, and then once they became very common, they all had editions, but they probably didn't have copies of the first edition because, like other things, these guys are fairly rare, and there's been a long-term controversy about what is the true first edition of this book. For a long time, it was thought that part 1 at the Nelson Atkins Gallery in Kansas City was the first edition. It has a fantastic Chinese art collection, so it's not unreasonable to think they'd have it. But in 1975, a Japanese scholar, Kohara, wrote an article saying that this copy that was owned by a bookstore owner in Kyoto was in fact the true first edition. And he gave some pretty convincing evidence for why it was. But a few years ago, I happened to come across another copy of this Japanese edition called the Nakayama edition, because that's the name of the bookstore owner. And when I started talking to book scholars and people who knew about prints, they said, well, it's not solved, which is the first edition. In fact, Kohara didn't really solve it because he didn't look at all the editions and say that his edition was better than all the editions. So what you have to do is you have to look at all the editions and then find out which is the best one. So that, again, I tried to finesse that for a while, and I ended up having to do just what I did with the 10 Bamboo Studio, of taking hundreds, thousands of pictures, printing them out, and comparing them. And it's more complicated than the 10 Bamboo Studio, so it's a good thing I started with the 10 Bamboo Studio, because there's at least 8 different Chinese editions of part 1. And in the 10 Bamboo Studio, there are only 3 Chinese editions. The only saving grace is it's very easy to tell the Japanese editions from the Chinese editions of Mustard Seed Garden, so I didn't have to worry about those. So the summary is, how do you tell what's the first edition? Every single character on every single one of the editions is exactly the same. There's no clue from what's written on the books. They just look identical. So you have to say which is best artistically, which is best in terms of the quality of printing. And then there are some other clues you can use, mostly to exclude editions as opposed to include them. So I can pretty easily throw away 3 or 4 of the editions as just having no chance of being a first edition, and only left with about 4. And the one that very clearly artistically is the greatest is this is the cover page of the Tin Bamboo Studio Mustard Seed Garden painting manual. And the early imprints will have this big red seal on the top. One of the things which has slowed up progress in the study of Chinese color prints is there were no good examples published of facsimile editions of real good ones. Last year, the National Museum of China published finally a very good facsimile edition of their copy of the Tin Bamboo Studio. And about 4 years ago, a museum in Japan published a facsimile edition of their copy of this edition of the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual. That was incredibly expensive, but luckily it was pirated in China right away. And so it's now quite inexpensive. And it has a number of features that you can see in some of the leaves which are shown down in the gallery and are not found in any of the later editions, and always corners are cut in competing editions. One is a few pages on some of the early things. These are trying to teach people how to paint. So here's how to make foliage. But these have tint blocks. There's 2 colors here, 2 colors there, a light blue and then black. The competing editions don't have those. They don't have the tint blocks here. This is just one of the full color landscape volumes from this. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of this in my collection. I'm trying very hard. But as I say, looking, you can find them everywhere. I went to the National Central Library in Taipei last winter and was looking through their mustard seed garden stuff, and it was junk, 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 and then bong, this copy of this one facile came out. It was just a beautiful copy, in great condition, nice printing. So things are everywhere if you look for them. So I've located about a dozen of these early, what I think are the first editions of the Kangxi edition. So the Nakayama one, the one that Kohara originally published, has disappeared. Nobody knows where it's at. I think it's a very early printing. But there are 4 in Europe, 2 in the United States, one in Tokyo that has the nice facsimile edition. And then in the Shanghai Library, they have 3 copies. I've only seen 2 of them. But there are none in the National Central Library in Beijing, which you expect to have everything. So that gives some idea of again, how rare these are. The part 2 and part 3. Part 2 was how to paint things like bamboo and orchids, plum blossoms. This is a very early printing of the bamboo volumes of part 2 of the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual. Very nice, and there's a page showing downstairs. But then something strange happens. So from 1600 to 1701, all these wonderful Chinese color woodblock printed books came out, a lot of which we only know 1 or 2 copies of, but a few we have a dozen or more copies, and then it all stops. No great Chinese color printed books come out for about the next 200 years. And nobody quite knows why it stops. In Japan, they picked this up. The first major woodblock printed color book in Japan is a Japanese copy of the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual. This was done in Japan in 1748, 1753, and then the Japanese took off with color printing and just took it to so many marvelous places. And the Chinese just seemed to have lost interest in it until around the end of the 19th century. Then there was a very interesting revival in color printing that took place in China of a different nature. This had to do with an old art form, letter paper, that was done, actually, the first decorated paper in China is referred to in historical literature in the 8th century, and certainly a lot of references to it in the 10th century, but the earliest existing pieces of decorated letter paper are from the late Ming. And what you do is you have a design on a piece of paper that's 6 by 8, 4.5 by 8. And then on top of that, you write your letter. And if you have a long letter, you use several pieces of this. It could go on for 3, 4, 5, 10 pages. And people had used this all throughout the 18th and 19th century, but it was not very interesting letter paper. And then starting at the end of the 19th century, this form became reborn. And the most famous school of letter paper is that was centered in Beijing, and it's called Beiping Jianpu. Beiping was the name used for Beijing in the 1920s and 30s when the capital of China was in Nanjing, and so Northern Peace was, instead of Northern Capital, was the name that was used for Beijing. And this was often used, but nobody paid much attention to it. But a very famous cultural figure in China, probably the most famous one of, certainly other than Mao, maybe even more important than Mao, was Lu Xun. And he was very enamored with woodblock printing. And he got together with a young scholar of Chinese literature, Cheng Chengda, who turned out to be the greatest book collector of China in the 20th century. An amazing collection of books. And they got very, very excited about Beijing letter paper themselves. And there's a wonderful translation of the preface of this book that Lu Xun and Cheng Chengda put out in 1933, Beiping Jianpu, about how Lu Xun was ill, unfortunately, most of this time. Had Cheng Chengda go up to Beijing, and he'd go to this letter paper shop, and the ones say, oh, I don't want to cooperate with you, and then this other one would. And he got so excited, and he'd come back to his room and look through the letter paper and just, almost die. And so in this thing, they also talk about, gee, who's going to be interested in this? Nobody is. We'll make 50 copies. No, let's make 100. Oh, nobody will make 100. They insist on making 200 copies of these things because you have to get lots of different woodblock print shops to cooperate with you. You have to get the blocks from them and you put them all on the standard sheet of paper so they can come out and be bound as a bound volume. And so finally they decided on 200 copies of this book. And it caused a real sensation in Beijing. People were just thrilled. They had no idea that this art form was right underneath their noses the whole time. And needless to say, these 200 copies of the book disappeared and are impossible to get a hold of. There are a few museums in the United States. Well, Art Institute of Chicago, I guess, is the only one I know of that has one. The woodblock print companies that were involved in contributing to the designs to this book of letter paper, the largest one was Rongbao Jai. And Rongbao Jai said, this is such a hit, we'll put out our own copy. So in the Beijing Jianpu, the big set of 300 specimens of letter paper that Lu Xun and Cheng Chengda put out, about half of them were from Rongbao Jai. So Rongbao Jai put out their own book of letter paper called Rongbao Jai Beiping Jianpu. And there's copies of that downstairs in the gallery. So this was done 2 years after the Lu Xun book in 1935. And I'm sure that Rongbao Jai printed this out many times until 1951. And when the communists reorganized industries and stuff in Beijing, they took all of the woodblock shops, which were on this street Liu Lichang, and put them together and called that combined woodblock printing shop Rongbao Jai. So Rongbao Jai is the only woodblock printing shop in Beijing after 1950, 51. There's one in Shanghai, Duoyunshen, which also did letter paper and things like this. And Rongbao Jai made these kind of anthologies every 2 or 3 years, mostly the same pictures. There's always a few differences in every volume until about 1957. And these are pictures from the kind of things that were in the Rongbao Jai shop. A lot of them were by very famous artists of the time, like Pu Shani. Some of them were not so famous, and occasionally they were even by anonymous artists, but they really had major artists contributing to this art form. Bu Zheng is, again, a very well-known artist. Zhang Dezhen has gotten extremely famous in the day, but he was a major contributor to the letter paper that was done. But there was a second strand of letter paper that I want to sort of end up with by talking about that is not so well known because it was done in Shanghai. But this involved very famous Shanghai artists at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, like Rani, Zhang Sheng, Chen Weian, Ren Shun, Ju Cheng, and others. And they're, to me, a little off-putting at first because they seem a little gauche. And then you realize that Shanghai painting was always considered gauche painting, really bad-mannered people painting bold, brash, glitzy, poor taste kind of things. And so if you see some of this stuff, ooh, wow, yeah, no, that's not very literati-like. That's bold and brash and in poor taste. And I have started wondering, and thinking about this talk, what could have initiated this? And one of the things that I thought of that may happen is that aniline dyes were discovered just before this time. And these are not, some of these at least are not good natural colors. They are artificial colors. I bet they come from aniline dyes. And I bet aniline dyes started to be imported in China 1860, 1870. And so my suspicion is that it's the confluence of this new kind of color with the artists being interested in, the really famous artists being interested in designing letter paper that led to the rebirth of this. This Shanghai letter paper actually starts a little earlier than the Beijing letter paper, 1880s stuff, so maybe there. And here's a book that's downstairs, another book of Shanghai letter paper. These are from Yixing teapots. I know a lot of people know about Yixing pottery ware. And again, these are by famous artists. This particular book was made in Tianjin. And the One-Mei Jai studio, the studio Tianjin, which is sort of the seaport for Beijing, later they must have sold their copyright or blocks or something to Rongbao Jai because you start seeing some of their designs appearing in the later Rongbao Jai books of Beijing. So they only had a short lifetime. And finally ended up with even modern times, people doing all sorts of things. So there's an enormous number of letter paper there that's impossible to organize. And so I just want to end up with, in a sense, a sort of an optimistic note, is that so much of the great Chinese color woodblock printing has really just been discovered in the last 50 years and only been in wide circulation in the last half dozen years in terms of reproductions. So nobody has attempted to really write a history of color woodblock printing and all the different contributions that are made step by step and who made them and why. And the second thing is that the history of color woodblock printing has not yet also been established. No one's decided what are the earlier ones and what are the later ones. But in some ways, it's an easy thing to do. I can't do it, but it's an easy thing to do for somebody because letters are often dated. So you can date the letters and put them in some sort of an order and find out how they were done. So again, this is a great time to be interested in Chinese color woodblock prints. Thank you. No.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, why was there this long gap? And there's a few mysteries in Chinese civilization where gaps happen. The great age of Chinese exploration stopped, and then nobody knows why it stopped again. It was sort of in the Ming, and why China was sending ships everywhere around the world, and then they stopped. Yeah, so no good idea so far. Yes.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. My question is, do you know anything about the transmission of the technology in Japan?
A little, but it's not been worked on a whole lot. And it's thought that the big problem with color printing is the registration problem of how do you put one color on top of another color? How do you register the things? In Japan, they register things with the Kento system where they have notches in the blocks. There's
Subsequent to what you're discussing.
Yeah, there's some evidence, but it's not really been pursued, that the Chinese did have a Kento system too, not for printing pictures, but for printing text. The Chinese first did multicolor printing by making commentary to text. So the text would be in black and the commentary would be in yellow, and then maybe even some other commentary in red and so forth. And it was thought that, at least in some cases, these were aligned by Kento thing. I've always been curious, whether the Japanese ever used Chinese registration methods or not. There's a Japanese woodblock printing studio that's active today in Kyoto that has the blocks from this 1831 book. And about every 20 or 30 years, they pull it out and they print up a couple hundred copies and sell it. And I would like to know whether they use at all any Chinese methods to print Chinese type books. I suspect they don't, but I don't know. Yeah.
Japanese, as I understand it, especially during the 19th and 20th century, used multiple plates for a single picture to get multiple colors.
Yeah.
Did the Chinese do that?
Not really. What they had was this multiple block system where they'd have I should have showed a picture. They have a printing table, and you put the block on the table, and you took the piece of paper, put it over there, and then you rubbed it down. But the block was not the same size for every color. There'd be the blocks for the brown color would be small little blocks, and they'd glue them down on the table with wax, align them, and put that over. So, and then they'd take away the brown blocks and put on the yellow blocks for the flower petals, and just those yellow blocks would be inked and bokashied, and they'd pull it over, line up. And if you go to Rongbao today, you can see them print letter paper that way. And Rongbao, most of the time, most of its color printing business is in making reproductions of well-known Chinese painting. And it's just unbelievable how closely you can copy a Chinese painting this way. In the Ten Bamboo Studio, sometimes it looks like the registration is not very good, but I'm sure that's on purpose to make it look more painterly. A painter doesn't line things up. If you look to some of the letter paper where they're using very fine lines, then the registration there is perfect. So if the Chinese want to do perfect registration, they can do perfect registration. If they want to look painterly, they can do painterly. But the registration methods are thought to be quite different. Of course, Japanese registration is fantastic, almost always.
But I think part of the question is there are surprising differences in how they carried it out. But in the 17th century Chinese books, as in much later Japanese prints, every color is done with a different block. It's not like you carve the whole thing, and then when you're inking it, you ink this part, and then you ink this part. You have to have a different block for every color.
Except for the very, very, very earliest Chinese printings, those ones done in the 1600s, like 1606. Then they would take a block and they'd paint the brown, and then they'd paint the green, and then they'd paint the red, and then they'd put the piece of paper on. That only went for about 10 years or something like this. It's called dolly printing and Western printing. And it's not a good way to make a living as a color printer, so, yeah. Yeah.
You ever thought about or looked for hand coloration on any of these works?
Yeah. I haven't thought about it as much as I should, and when I was in Taiwan looking at this one set of woodblock prints last winter, a few months ago, a guy there said, "Look at this one. Doesn't that look like it has some hand coloration on it?" And I, "Oh, geez, maybe it does. It looks a little different." One of these very early sets that I didn't show any pictures of that owned by the Mubon Foundation, they're all of plum blossom branches, and some of them have a silvery color to them that I've never seen in any other prints. And I wonder whether somebody has come down and put those in, but it's the only extant copy. So until you find a second copy, you'll never get even close to whether it's hand done or printed. Yes.
I've always wondered at the foredge of the books, there's some text that's folded in half.
Yeah.
What is that text?
That's the title of the book or the short title of the book. But that's only in a string-bound book. So like the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual is a string-bound book. And so I didn't bring a piece of paper with you. The way you do string-bound books in Japan is you have a piece of paper and you print like this, and then you turn it back on itself so the printing is on the outside, and you end up string binding this part, and so you have two blank pieces of paper looking through. Paper is always very thin, so almost always you can see through. Occasionally, they'll put a piece of paper in between. That's very rarely done, but in one of the Mustard Seed Garden volumes downstairs, the real string-bound books, on the left-hand side, there's actually a piece of paper stuck inside every piece, so that volume is very thick. It's very unusual. It's the only one I've ever seen like that. And then the hashara will be along here, and we'll give the title and then sometimes the page number. Hashara, I guess, is a Japanese word. I don't know what Chinese, there's a good Chinese word for it, too. Yeah. Yes.
Those pages that have both artwork and poems, do the poems reflect the artwork, or are they independent of it?
They probably reflect it, but they're fairly vague. Usually, there's a volume, but somebody's gone through and said if somebody's talking about a camellia and the art in the poem, is there a camellia in the painting? And usually there is. If somebody's talking about a pear in the painting, is there a pear in the poem? And usually there is. Yeah, somebody went through all the plant names and tried to see whether, if they mentioned a plant in the poem, whether it's the right plants in the thing, and they seem to be lined up that way. But sometimes it's very vague. They're just talking about plum, so you don't know whether they're talking about this plum or some other plum. Yes.
Yeah, there are a few questions about influence on Japanese printing, and you mentioned there were some, early examples of, form of art embossing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, when you sort of step back after you've looked at thousands of these images, do you, see any, influences on other, art movements or styles in any other parts of the world that could have been gleaned from the Chinese printing tradition?
Well, certainly, everybody thinks that French art from the end of the 19th century is influenced by Japanese art. The French had two kinds of Japanese prints in front of them. the ukiyo-e prints, which you're familiar with, but they also had lots and lots of copies. All the great copies of what are called ehon, illustrated books, were French. The copies are 1900, 1910, 1920. And about half the ehon were ukiyo-e, but the other half the ehon were of a different tradition entirely, that were centered more around Kyoto, which is where most of the Chinese style printing went. And it was much less dependent on flat blocks of color, the way ukiyo-e is, and much more on swooping lines and things like this. And so there's a good PhD dissertation to look at the effects of ehon on French painting, because the French had them, had lots of them. Yeah. And these, I think, were the ones that were most closely related to the Chinese tradition. Very.
I wonder about a Korean connection, aesthetically and technically, of Korean artists adopting some of these styles and being intermediary with Japan.
Yeah. Everybody, the couple of people I've read thinks that every Korean artist had a copy of the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual next to them. Not particularly a good early fine one, but nevertheless one. Even though the Japanese made editions of it, I have never seen a Korean edition or never referred to it until modern times. I saw one in Korea a couple of years ago, but it was done in 10 years ago or 20 years ago, all in Korean. But I think it's just a translation. But it's clear that all the Japanese manga painters, they just refer to it a lot. What are the important painting manuals? What are the unimportant ones? And Mustard Seed. And several of them are actually owned by well-known Japanese painters. Their seals are on them. The Huntington Gardens in Los Angeles has a copy of the Ten Bamboo Studio that has seals on of well-known, I think they're Japanese painters of around the 1750s. I can't quite remember. So the Japanese painters had these for sure. Yeah.
You said that it's easy to tell the difference between the Japanese and the Chinese editions.
Of Mustard Seed.
Yes, so could you tell us what those differences are?
Well, it took me, yeah. The Japanese got tired of messing with butterfly binding. So part 3 of the Mustard Seed in Chinese editions is butterfly bound and the pages go falling out. The Japanese decided to put an end to this by doing string binding. So instead of having a full page like the Chinese do, they put blocks around each thing and tie it. So part 3 you can see from across the room whether it's Chinese or Japanese. Part 2 is actually probably harder to do, and I'm being bold. My reason for that is that the titles and stuff are often extant, and you get to recognize them as the kind of titles that Hishigawa Magabe put on all his books and stuff like this. And for part 1, this has caused some people to get very bent out of shape. I don't quite know why. The Japanese reshuffled the deck. So they took the decks of part 1, part 2, and part 3, the Chinese version, and they took part of part 3 and put it in the beginning, and then they put part 1, stuck it in there, this and that. So just the order of them. So the only place where the order is not messed up is part 2, the painting manuals for plum, bamboo, orchid, and chrysanthemum. And those are the only ones you could ever really confuse at all with the Japanese one from across the room. Yes.
Your description of the early printing of Ten Bamboo Studios is such an advanced technique at that point in time, but we really don't seem to know what came before. As someone who spent a lot of time on this material, do you have any speculation about how something this technically advanced came to be?
Well, one thing is everybody thinks that Ming printers are really good all over the place. And they all were from south of the Yangtze, Nanjing, Huzhou, Anhui. So it's, culturally, it's not a big part of China. And if you think of all the books we have one copy of, then you have to think of all the books we have no copies of. And there's got to be a lot of those. And so it's going to be a little hard to do that. But beginning of the 17th century, you have this dolly printing where you just have lines which are colored. And so the big change is actually with these letter paper books done in the 1620s and then the mustard, in the ten bamboo in the 1630s, where you get broad bands of things and people are solving the registration problem. I assumed that the Chinese, like the Japanese, could have done color woodblock printing back in 1300 if they wanted to. But it just wasn't commercially viable, probably. And so there are very crude kinds of Chinese printing done, 1200, where they use stencil printing. And Japanese printing is done in colors much before pictorial printing. They're printing mathematics books and astronomy books and things like that. And so it's not really, and no artist is involved. But if they wanted to, they could do it. Yeah.
Could it be that the growing prosperity in the early 1600s and maybe late 1500s created a much better market for it, and more people wanted to have
Yeah, I think that's,
copies of these things?
yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm sure that's maybe even the most important thing, that at the end of the Ming, there was luxury products were very popular, and the Ten Bamboo Studio was a luxury product. It was not meant for every mensch to have. I'm sure they're very expensive, and only the upper literati had them. So I think it's part of the whole, yeah, the whole upper literati culture that prospered so much in the late Ming. Yes.
A little different direction. Your own collection, how do you approach conservation?
Of all of the copies of the Ten Bamboo Studio I've ever seen, there's only been 2 that have not been remounted. And almost always, you take this butterfly bound thing and you put it flat and you reback it and have it flat like this. If the thing is going to be in good condition when you see it in 2016, this has been done back in the 17th or 18th century, this flatness things. So I've seen a couple of copies that are just pristine condition and they've been made flat and rebacked like this. After you reback it, you then put a piece of stiff paper on it, so it's much easier to turn the pages. The only exceptions to that I've never seen rebound is this incredible copy in the National Library of China that for some strange reason they let me have and look at it, and they've not been rebacked. And when you're done with it, you find little pieces of paper on the table afterwards, and you just feel like, oh my goodness. The other copy is down in the gallery. There's 4 bound volumes there, and those have been, one of them's not been rebacked. I've had the other ones rebacked, but they put them back into what looks like to a normal person butterfly bonding, but actually a very clever conservator found a way to keep them from all falling out. One of them still left that way. Yeah.
So have you personally done anything to the collection in the way of conservation?
Yeah.
When you run into, mold boxing, immediately to a conservator, or?
Yeah. I think these really early ones, for some incredible reason, that's just the way I got them. So they've been flattened, right? So they're not folded in the center. If you go down and look, they're all flattened. And they're not that dirty, so I think it happened a fair time ago. There's all sorts of strange, interesting questions with really early ones. Libraries, if they own a copy, they try to make it into a book. museums, they have a copy, try to make it into a print, something flat. So you see a big difference that way, but they're always remounted. The 10 Bamboo Studio. The mustard seed, there's a Chinese way of conserving things where you take a blank book and you interleave the leaves and turn it that way. And so almost any Chinese book more than about 200 years old has been conserved, at least in this traditional Chinese manner. But that doesn't involve rebacking it. I think, as I say, every other copy of 10 Bamboo Studio has been rebacked. It's just so incredibly fragile that you just can't deal with it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh, great. Thank you all for coming out to join us. This exhibition is on view until early October, I think. We meant to bring up, and I don't know if we did, the brochures for the exhibition are hot off the presses. Do we have some on the table out there? I'm looking for Jan. I thought we were going to bring those up. Okay, that didn't happen. They're in the gallery now. There's probably not enough to. We have some down in the office. I can bring some up. I will bring some up. Okay, we'll get some in the next 10 minutes. We were delayed in getting that out, but they are here today because I wanted to have them in time for tonight's lecture. So I hope you'll have many times to come and see the show because you do see more every time that you look. And I want to let you know that the exhibition that will follow, Splashes of Color, will similarly rely on the generosity of a Seattle area collector. David Paley is lending us works of Japanese children's kimono. So that's coming up in the fall. So I hope you'll come back to see that as well. So thanks very much, and I just encourage you to hang around for enough time for Jan to bring up copies of the brochure for this exhibition. Thanks again.